It's time to get to the 2024 college football season that kicks off this weekend with a few changes. A number of college football powerhouses have changed conferences this year, resulting in the Power 5 conferences becoming the Power 4 conferences. In addition to that, the playoffs have been expanded from 4 schools to 12 schools, with the postseason lasting 1 full month. Who better to talk to than my next guest here? He is the mouth of the South, the reigning champion as far as I'm concerned when it comes to analysis of college football. The one and only Paul Finebaum is in the house. My pleasure, buddy. What's going on, man? How you doing? How you doing?
I am doing great. It's such a thrill to be on with you, Stephen A. Thank you so much.
Man, please, the honor is all mine. Although you and I have gotten into it a little bit over the last few weeks with the blasphemy coming out of your mouth. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I almost had a heart attack. I almost faded. I said I'm in great health. I'm feeling great. I'm in the best shape I've been in nearly 30 years. And then Paul Finebaum almost sent me to my grave because in a world where we're looking at the top 12 schools, you talk about 12 schools, not a 14 playoff, a 12-team playoff, you actually indicated it's a possibility that Alabama wouldn't even qualify. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe you said it. I'm going to give you an opportunity to correct the error of your ways, Paul Finebaum, and tell the world that something was wrong with you that day, that you did not mean what you said.
The only thing wrong that day, Stephen A. Smith, was your hearing, because I said there was a possibility. I didn't declare Alabama dead. In fact, I think they will make the playoff right on the cut line. But your reaction, I don't know what your health is, and I'm not asking for your private physician to show me your latest physical, but I think it's time for you to go back and see the funny guy with the hat, because I have rarely, if ever, seen you melt down like that over something as trivial as Alabama possibly missing the playoffs. Stephen A., your buddy Nick Saban is working at ESPN now. He's no longer the coach. And if you don't understand what that means, then you need to come down here to the South and I'll give you a tutorial.
Well, what about Kayden DeBoer? Everybody's been raving about the man. The man is 25-13 over the last 25-3. I'm sorry, over the last 2 years. He was in the national championship game last year. Okay, he's won 90% of his games as a head coach. All right, no matter where he's been, including 3 national titles on the Division II level before he arrived in Washington. He's a 2-time Pac-12 Coach of the Year. This dude is no slouch now, Paul Finebaum. I mean, he's got a pretty damn good resume.
Well, he does. He wouldn't have gotten the job without all that, but that doesn't mean anything. Stephen, I've covered Alabama a long time, as you know. Do you realize, and I hate to give you trivia questions here, but every coach at Alabama since Bear Bryant retired, he retired in 1982. Do you realize every coach at Alabama in his first year has lost 4 games or more? What I'm saying is that is a difficult transition. It's not like taking over in certain places. There's so much pressure. And this is a guy that has a schedule. I'm not saying he's going to lose 4 games, but he could lose 3, and 3 would knock him out of the playoffs. And it's not that far-fetched, and I'll tell you why. He has a road game against Michigan the 3rd week of the season. I think they'll win that game, but it's tricky. And then he's got Georgia at home. I don't care about the record last year or the year before against Georgia. Georgia has a better team than Alabama. He goes on the road to Knoxville, Tennessee, LSU and Baton Rouge, and Norman, Oklahoma. It's not far-fetched to think he could lose a couple of games. He's also got Missouri at home. Stephen A., this is not a lock. This is not saying Nick Saban's going to be in the playoffs like he was almost every year of his tenure at Alabama. This is a completely different situation.
I love how you bring up the fact that Nick Saban is no longer there. And obviously those are huge shoes to fill, and as a result, that can be an impediment to the success of Alabama. But you just shove aside, when you talk about Michigan, you say you think they'll win that game. Jim Harbaugh is no longer this. Ron Moore, I mean, we assume he can coach or what have you, but we don't know what he could do. When we talk about the reigning, defending national champion Michigan Wolverines, what are your expectations for them for this upcoming season, in light of the fact that Harbaugh is no longer there?
Hey, let me correct myself. I think Alabama's playing at Wisconsin, not Michigan, so I'm glad you brought Michigan up. I think Michigan is a really good team. Jerome Moore did a good job last year. I mean, I wasn't crazy about some of the things he said, all the kumbaya about Jim Harbaugh, but he got the job
and the
done.
crying. And the crying, Paul. Let's not forget the crying. I didn't understand all that crying after they won the game. It really annoyed me, but go ahead.
No, he did. I mean, I was 100. We were in 100% agreement. It was too much, but he won the big games. He survived. Listen, I think Stephen A. Smith could have coached that team to the playoffs last year. It wasn't that difficult considering the talent that Jim Harbaugh had assembled. But their schedule is going to do them in. They have Texas the second week of the season, and they can lose. If they lose the Texas game, I think they're going to be essentially out of the playoffs because they're not going to beat Ohio State for the fourth year in a row. They've got I think they've got a bunch of other schools like Oregon's on that schedule, Washington, the SC. It is a tremendous challenge, and it's not. They'll take a slight step back. They won't make the playoffs.
When you're looking at the top team in the nation, I'm just looking at Ohio State now. They got this kid, Jeremiah Smith, that everybody's been raving about, having the potential. He's the best recruit in the nation at the position. Obviously, you see about some of the superstar transfers they have available to them. Chip Kelly's their new offensive coordinator. A lot of people are talking about Ohio State and the kind of noise that they're making, but I know I'm talking to the mouth of the South and one of the elite football analysts in America, college or pros. So I know how you feel about Georgia. Where is your mindset right now? Because even though they call you the mouth of the South, the fact is you're known for your objectivity. You're going to call it like you see it. Are you viewing Ohio State as the top team in the nation, or are you viewing Georgia in that regard?
I'm giving Georgia a slight edge, Stephen A. I think in many ways Ohio State has more talent. I mean, they went on a buying spree last winter, which is now legal in college football, and ended up with just an enormous class. The difference between Georgia and Ohio State is the quarterback position. Will Howard is a transfer over from Kansas State. He is serviceable. He is not elite. Carson Beck is very likely the number one QB that's going to be taken in the draft. And I think that's essential. But I think they'll meet for the national championship. The path of the national championship will be fascinating, though. And what we see today in August is not exactly what we're going to see at the end of the playoffs. The playoff does not end until January 20th. Last year, the season ended on January 8th. Why am I bringing this up? We have a playoff for the first time that goes on beyond more than 2 games. You could conceivably play 4 or 5 games if you don't get the top 4 seeds, and there's going to be attrition. So how much depth do you have? I think right now Ohio State probably has more depth than Georgia, but I'll still give Georgia the slight edge because of the quarterback position. But not much.
I got you. Let's get into a conversation real quick, Paul, about the transfer portal. Who do you think won in that regard? How have you felt about the transfer portal? How has it affected college football? And who do you think won this offseason?
Ohio State won. They got the quarterback I mentioned a minute ago. Not only that, they got Judkins from Ole Miss. He was the best running back in the SEC 2 years ago. He had some issues with Lane Kiffin about playing time, so he found the place that he wanted to go. He got Caleb Downs from Alabama. Stephen A., you've been at it. You know how good Caleb Downs was, arguably the best freshman in the country last year. He's a DB for Nick Saban. He almost went to Georgia. Ohio State figured out a way to get him there. That is valuable. As important as he is for Ohio State in the defensive backfield, he's hurting Alabama by not being there because he could control a game. That's just a couple of players. They got Alabama's center. They got Julian Sayin, who's not a well-known player. He was Alabama's top recruit this incoming season. He was a 5-star from Southern California that Nick Saban worked hard to recruit. He shows up on campus for a couple of weeks, and he's gone the day after Saban leaves. So, I mean, they had a monstrous take. Outside of Ohio State, probably Ole Miss had the best class in the portal, and that's why Lane Kiffin's program in Oxford is one of the top 5 or 6 teams in the country this year.
Kind of surprised. You mentioned about 3 guys that departed from Alabama the second Saban left, and obviously Kaylin DeBoer comes on board. What are we to make of that, if anything at all? Because, again, I know you're not Saban, but in the same breath, you've had your level of success as well. And for players, the quality of Downs and others that were willing to depart to go to play for Ryan Day, who's had success but lost the last 3 years to Michigan, hasn't won a national title, one would think you would have given Kaylin DeBoer an opportunity. What do you make of that, the fact that they did it?
Well, Stephen, what happened was Saban announces on a Wednesday that he's leaving. I mean, there is shock. DeBoer comes in on Friday, and it took him a couple of days to to gather up and to go at full speed. And in the process, the Sharks are out there. You know that. You know the way college football is right now. There's Kirby Smart. Right. There's Ryan Day. There's other coaches. And just a couple of things got lost in the translation. Caleb Downs, everybody thought was going to play for Kirby Smart. But Saban's the most interesting one. There's a book out next week that says that Kayden DeBoer had a meeting with Saban, and he asked Julian Saban how to spell his name, and the kid said, "I'm out of here." I mean, these are minor things, but Nick Saban would have never made a mistake like that. And I'm not suggesting that DeBoer isn't an elite coach. I think he is, but coaching at Alabama is not like coaching at Washington or at some NAIA school. It's a different world, and the Sharks that are out there coming in and literally stealing players off your roster right now make the old days of college basketball recruiting really look tame. I mean, it is vicious, and it's also the money is unbelievable.
That's the reason why Nick Saban retired. I mean, Nick Saban and I, when we sat in his office, we spoke privately about this. He considered it embezzlement, for crying out loud. He said that the game has deteriorated, not the game on the field, but in terms of recruiting, getting talent to your program, et cetera, he was just really, really down on the climate and how it had changed and indicated that it had played a pivotal role in his willingness to step away from the game of football. Do you see it getting any better or worse in the world of college football?
No, and I'm glad you told that story. That's a very little known story about that conversation you had with him, because he did not share information like that with very many people, and I know how much he trusted you. And I mentioned this once on First Take, but when you came down and spoke at to his team a couple of years ago, I'm told by people inside that building, and let me tell you, they had Chris Paul this year. They've had Mike Tyson. They've had Pete Rose. They've had Kobe. Stephen A. Smith is considered the best speaker ever to a Nick Saban team in Tuscaloosa. So he trusted you. He told you things that he didn't tell a lot of the rest of us, Stephen A., but he couldn't handle it anymore, and he didn't need to handle it anymore. He was 72 years old. He had won 7 national championships. He had retired the trophy, so to speak, and he could not deal with it because there were players on the plane ride to Pasadena, Stephen A., for the national semifinal who were hitting up assistant coaches about, hey, what am I going to get? It was the season could be, if it's over next week or the week after, I'm thinking about going somewhere else. I mean, that's where these guys are right now. I don't blame them for wanting their money, but if you're 72 and you've done it all, you don't want to deal with it.
What do you make of the teams that changed conferences? We've got teams in the Big 12 now that were in the Pac-12, and obviously teams in the Big 10 now that wasn't in the Big 10 before. Speak to that and the kind of effect you think that's going to have on a game of college football.
Well, there's a couple of really important ones to keep your eye on. Texas left the Big 12 for the SEC. Texas was in the playoffs last year. Another one that really matters is Oregon. Oregon is the top 3 team in the country this year under Dan Lanning. May have one of the top quarterbacks as well, and Dylan Gabriel. So that's going to really shake up the Big Ten. If you had to say what's the biggest game of the year in college football this year, it is going to be Ohio State at Oregon. And some people watching are going, I didn't really even realize Oregon was in the Big Ten. The one that's not making much of an impact is Southern Cal under Lincoln Riley. They're now in the Big Ten as well. They announced 2 years ago, as opposed to a year later with Oregon and Washington, and that's a program that's really in a lot of trouble in the year after Caleb Downs. So those are the ones to keep your eye on. Colorado is now in the Big 12 from the Pac-12. So I mean, there's mass chaos. And think about this, Stephen A. In the ACC this season, they will be playing with SMU, which was in the American last year, and Stanford and California. Stanford and California are now playing in the same league with Syracuse, Florida State, North Carolina, and Miami.
One of the reasons I brought you on this show is because I want you to preview tomorrow's game between Florida State and Georgia Tech. I wanted to get in that, but before I did any of that, I've got to ask you, because you brought up 3 programs with very prominent names at the head coaching position. Let's start first with USC and Lincoln Riley. You have been unapologetic and very, very candid about your feelings about him, and you said he should be on the hot seat, and if he doesn't produce this year, he needs to be gone. Speak to why you've been so down on Lincoln Riley and what kind of hope or enthusiasm you could put, or anybody could potentially have towards him for this upcoming season? Because I get the sense that you don't have much for him.
I don't. And listen, you have Caleb Williams as your quarterback, and you throw away a season because you don't spend enough time on the defensive side of the ball. That's not something new for Lincoln Riley. We all know who his quarterbacks were at Oklahoma. I mean, he had Kyler Murray, he had Baker Mayfield and Jalen Hurts, and he couldn't. And he normally, I think one year they went to overtime with Georgia, but the other 2 years in the playoffs they were literally blown out of the entire stadium. He went out and got another coordinator from UCLA. Things are supposed to be better, but I don't believe it. Lincoln Riley, to me, is not a top-flight coach. I think he has missed his moment. You go back 2 years ago, there was so much enthusiasm in that program. He owned L.A. for a very brief time, and Caleb won the Heisman, and they had a great season his first year, but they couldn't sustain it, and I think it will be much more difficult now.
Primetime Deion Sanders, University of Colorado. Started off strong, 3-0, and then after that they nosedived and obviously won one of their last 8 games or what have you. And we know, including 6 straight, and we know that he's been in the news on a lot of occasions over the last few months. The sizzle is always with Primetime. You know, I think that he has the potential to be a great coach. I know he's the greatest cornerback that ever lived, and I think that he's an elite motivator. My wish for him is that he had gotten a Florida State job when he wanted it before Colorado ever came along, or he had gotten a job at Texas A&M. That would have been my wish for him in competing in the SEC. I think being in Boulder, Colorado, I don't like his chances, Paul Finebaum. But your thoughts about Primetime Deion Sanders and what that program is going to do?
Well, they owned the college football season last year for about 5 weeks, and some of it was predicated on upsetting TCU and then beating Nebraska. Having people like you, Shannon, The Rock, others show up, and it just infused so much energy that everybody wanted to watch them. And then when they went off the cliff, people turned away, and I don't think they're turning back this season, Stephen A., and I think that's going to frustrate Coach Prime. I have great respect for him. He's recruited a lot of amazing players. I mean, Travis Hunter might be the best player in the country, but it's not enough. And the league is easier this year being in the Big 12, but he's still, to be relevant, has to be a playoff contender, and I don't think they are. In the moment that they lose enough games where they're no longer part of the conversation, I think we will all move on to those who matter most, and I think that will drive him crazy. I agree with you. You put him in any number of places, and he can recruit the talent. You can only recruit a limited amount of talent to Boulder. So I hope he's patient, but ultimately I think that's a dead-end job for him.
Do you believe that he'll ultimately get a job at a big-time program, or do you believe that times are going to be so rough that it could ruin his future prospects of getting a job at a big-time program?
I think ADs know what he's capable of. Now, some will not hire him. You know that, and I know that. But there are athletic directors out there at good schools who need a change agent who I think will take the chance. By the way, not a chance. Make a very smart move. I think there are a lot of places that he could completely turn it upside down where he would have a legitimate chance. By the way, Auburn's another school that could have had him 2 years ago, and they ended up hiring Hugh Freeze, who was run out of the business 8 or 9 years ago at Ole Miss. But somebody will take a chance on him, and I think they'll be rewarded. I give Colorado credit for trying. He's changed that. He's made that place at least a conversation piece, but ultimately it's still Colorado, and they are never, even with Deion Sanders, going to be a significant player in college football.
You know, the next person I'm going to bring up, I'm incredibly fond of. I haven't spoken to him in over a year, but I've always been very, very fond of Dabo Swinney. Goes to the national championship for the, National College Football Players 4 or 5 years. Won 2 national championships. Give him a lot of credit where credit is due, no question about it. Over the last several years, the worst season he had was last season, where he went 9-4. But I do find myself, I can't wait to see him. I got a lot of love for him, but he's old school, and he's somebody that seems very averse to the changing times. Doesn't want to adjust and adapt, but so much. And I think that actually may get in the way of any future success he's hoping to have at Clemson. Your thoughts about the one and only Dabo Swinney. There was a time when we talked about Saban. We were talking about him. When we talked about Kirby Smart. When we talked about, obviously, Urban Meyer at the time when he was in college football. We still found ourselves talking about Dabo Swinney. That isn't the case at this particular moment in time. Your thoughts about the Clemson head coach?
It's remarkable what he did. He played for 4 national championships. He beat Nick Saban twice. He was in the playoffs a couple more times. But I think his term has ended, and he's done it to himself. And on one hand, Stephen A., you have to admire him. He stuck to his principles. He's very old school for a guy that's not that old. But it's hard to be old school in an age when players have their hands out and they have no loyalty. And I think he's been burned on that. And he's in a league now where Florida State is probably a little bit better. I think Miami could be better this year, and I think it makes it more complicated for him to return to prominence. It's not impossible to get in the playoffs now. He can do that. It's a little bit easier being in a 12 team than it was a 4 team. But I think the days when we talk about him on a regular basis on shows like yours every morning are over.
Paul Finebaum, last question. Florida State's opening the season. They're kicking off the college football season against Georgia Tech Saturday afternoon. First things first, your thoughts about Florida State and what happened to them last year when they weren't picked to be in the college football playoff, one of the 4 teams. Did you agree with that decision? Do you believe they got screwed over? What were your thoughts about that?
I completely agreed with the decision to leave them out. And by the way, I'm sorry. They lost a quarterback, Jordan Travis. That's part of football. Had he not been hurt, they probably would have gotten in. But I frankly thought the team that got screwed last year wasn't Florida State. It was Georgia. They were better than Florida State. And I'm not trying to use the 63-3 score in the Orange Bowl as a comparison because so many players had already opted out of Florida State. But Alabama was fortunate to get in. But the reason why Alabama got in is on the biggest stage of the year in college football, they beat the number 1 team, and that's the last thing that committee saw. As far as Saturday, I think they'll handle Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech's a good program. They're ascending. They beat Miami last year. They beat some other schools. But this to me looks like about a 2-touchdown game. I think Florida State is not what they were last year, but they're still pretty good. In fact, I like Miami to win the ACC this year.
Wow. Okay. Very, very last question. Biggest story in college football this season is what?
It's the playoffs because Stephen A., even though we talk about Alabama and post-Saban, that will fade away pretty quickly. But why it's so important is you can now lose an early season game. Michigan can lose to Texas. Alabama can drop the Georgia game at the end of September. Ohio State can go to Oregon in October. And it's not over. Right? I mean, the calculus is that 10-2 is probably going to get you in the playoffs. So instead of maybe 5 or 6 schools trying for those 4 spots, you may have 20 schools. And even more important than that, at the end of the season when things usually start to get pretty stale in college football and it's all about those 3 or 4 schools, now we have conversations just like you do in the NFL. Are you in the playoffs? Do you have a first-round bye? Do you have home field? College football is now the NFL, and Stephen A., the NFL sells well in this country.
One of the best college football analysts, one of the best football analysts in America, the one and only Paul Finebaum, blessing me with his presence. Thanks a lot, buddy. I'll see you soon, man. Thank you so much.
The pleasure was mine. Thank you, Stephen A.